How you doing, guys? Welcome back to Rewind Reviews. You know, believe it or not, there was a time before the Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of took over the world, and the movie that I'm going to be talking about today is actually a movie that not only predates the MCU, but it predates even the X-Men movies and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. This film came out in 1998 and it kind of set the standard for a lot of what Marvel became eventually, and that movie is Blade. Directed by Stephen Norrington and written by David S. Goyer, Blade follows a half-vampire, half-mortal man as he becomes a protector of the mortal race while slaying evil vampires. Based on the Marvel Comics character of the same name, the movie stars Wesley Snipes, Stephen Dorff, Chris Christopherson, Boucher Wright, Donald Logue, Ali Jova and Udo Kier. Blade has a slightly complicated history over the years because he's a character that wasn't really his own thing originally. He was created as like an antagonist in Marvel's Dracula comics. That's why Dracula kind of appears in Blade Trinity. But the character sort of developed from there and he did become quite a beloved character in Marvel Comics. The way that I was aware of him was through the 90s Spider-Man series, which did introduce quite a lot of big name characters like the Punisher and the Fantastic Four. So I was always kind of aware of who this character was, even when I was a bit younger than I really should have known. And my dad was a big fan of like Wesley Snipes movies and like big over the top 80s action movies, and he always has like this big collection of DVDs and videos and all sorts from throughout the years. And I remember seeing one of the ones for Blade and I kept thinking like, hey, that's the guy from the Spider-Man series. And I was always kind of curious about what the movie was because I knew the character was, knew a little bit about who he was, so I thought, oh, why can't I give this a go? Oh, it's rated an 18. So it took me quite a long time to actually get around to watching this movie for the first time. I watched it when I was like 17 or so, but it wasn't the first movie that I saw. I originally saw Blade Trinity first, and then I saw Blade 2, and then I saw this one. So this is the last one that I saw, which is a really interesting experience because I sort of knew everything that was going to happen and unfold, and there was a lot of things that were introduced in this movie that I was kind of confused why they weren't continued, because there was definitely a lot of setup for what the future of the Blade franchise was going to be, but they don't really do that. It was also one of the oldest Marvel movies that I had actually seen at that point in time, because yeah, there were movies out that predates like the X-Men era, which is like the 2000s, things like the Captain America movie. There was the Lou Ferrigno Hulk series, which did have movies, and one of them I have seen, and that's I think the one with Thor in it. Marvel Comics were in a really weird stage at that point in time because they kind of sold off a lot of their characters to other studios. I have gone over this in a lot of different videos, so I don't really want to repeat myself. And Blade was one of the ones who did get sold off as well. So New Line Cinemas were the ones who sort of took over this, and they had access to Iron Man and all sorts. But when it came to the characters that they were planning on doing films with, Black Panther was the one that they wanted to do, and they cast Wesley Snipes as T'Challa, but I don't know what it was that happened, whether it was just taking too long or what, but Wesley Snipes was getting a bit fed up of waiting around for it, and they basically, some of the people behind the scenes went, well, we're actually developing this other movie. It's going to be like a bit of a kung fu style movie called Blade. It's also based on a Marvel Comics superhero, and that's the movie that ultimately got made, and Wesley Snipes went over to that film. So yeah, we had to wait a long time to get a Black Panther movie, but we got Blade instead. And when it comes to Wesley Snipes as Blade himself, he is brilliant. He really does embody this character. There's nobody else that really could have played this character as well as he did. At this point in time, the Marvel Studios Blade movie hasn't been released. We haven't seen anything for it whatsoever. We only know that Mahershala Ali is being cast. He's a brilliant actor. I genuinely wish him best of luck in the future. I think he will be really good. It's just going to be interesting to see what direction they take with the character. When it comes to these movies, Wesley Snipes is absolutely perfect for this role. I absolutely love what he's able to do with his character. I like how he does sort of portray like he is quite emotionless. He does sort of come across like that, but there is humanity underneath. There is a few speckles of emotion that does come out, especially in a few of the scenes with Whistler, which does tie into the themes of this movie, where it is quite a case of like humans and monsters and where humanity sort of fits into things. That's sort of mirrored in Deacon Frost, who's played by Stephen Dorff. There's a lot of parallels between Blade and Deacon in this movie, and I think that's something that like the MCU's kind of taken advantage of in a lot of their more modern films. Deacon kind of represents like what Blade ultimately could be, where he's just kind of completely embraced the vampire side of him. That's the side that's completely taken over. He's basically got a similar motivation to Magneto, where he believes that vampires are the superior species. They should be the ones ruling over humanity. They should be in control. The vampires are sort of in control of this world. All the purebloods are kind of like keeping the vampires in the shadows, and he believes that they're wrong. He's not my favourite cast member out of everyone who's in this movie, but I do think he does bring some great elements to this character. He is able to sort of embody all these different elements of what makes this character who he is. A lot of big superhero villains always have to have like this sort of like sinister presence whenever they appear on the screen, but he seems very laid back. He's a lot more quite chilled out in a way, which does kind of separate him from a lot of the different villains that we have had over the years. And I do like that angle. I like that when he does snap, he actually can be a lot more frightening than you would expect him to be. And I really do like everything that they do with his role. I just think that there could have been just maybe a few more elements with him. Like, I would have liked to have seen the rivalry between him and Blade sort of built up a little bit more, because we kind of just drop straight in the middle of everything that's going on. Like, they're already both aware of each other. There's already this connection between the two of them before anything happens. There is even a twist as well that does involve his character, which I'm not going to spoil for anyone who isn't aware of it. But I do think that there are elements that I just think they could have just expanded on a little bit more. I do really like a lot of the cast members in this movie, like Mbushi Wright, who plays Karen, and Chris Christopherson, who plays Whistler. I quite like this version of Whistler. He's a little bit more hands-on, he gets involved in what Blade's getting up to. I like the way that him and Blade interact. There is a really good sort of connection between the two of them, a good bond that you do see elements of throughout the movie. It's the thing that brings the humanity out of Blade. It's the moments with Whistler when they're at their lowest, when it really does start getting brought out of him, and I love the way that those moments are handled. But when it comes to Mbushi Wright, her character Karen, she is kind of the main protagonist in a way, because she's our eyes into this world. We kind of follow a lot of what she gets up to, because she is a nurse who works as like she's like a blood specialist. I'm not quite sure what the official name is, but the point is, she isn't a like a damsel in distress or anything like that. She actually does get involved. She is able to help. She is very useful. She's very practical. I like her when it does come to some of the bigger action sequences. She does get involved and she does make a difference. She plays really well. I think it's very believable. I like the way that she's not like completely baffled by everything that's going on, but I think she does take it very realistically. This is how I think a normal person would react to all these big things that are getting revealed. I think that the way that the performance does work throughout the movie is very well done. My only issue with her character is purely that they clearly are setting her up to be a big part going forwards, and because I had seen 2 and 3 at this point, I knew that they don't follow that through. For some reason they just don't include her in the future movies, and I think that's a really big shame, because she is a good character. They were setting her up to be something a bit more, and they just don't do anything with her. Most of the cast is pretty alright in this movie. I think some of the extras, I think, could do with a little bit of work. I think like the police officer that Blade keeps interrogating, I think he's not brilliant, but he's fine. I like Donald Gloag. He's an actor who does sort of pop up every now and again. He is enjoyable to watch. He is definitely a lot of fun to see in this film. I think the way that a lot of the vampires themselves are portrayed, I think this movie can be a bit cheesy, and I think that some of the performances definitely do add to that, especially some of like the other vampires who do appear throughout the film. When it comes to the story for this movie, as I've said, there are definitely a lot of elements that the MCU kind of borrows for a lot of their movies. I don't believe Kevin Feige was involved in this one. I think he sort of started around the X-Men days, but there are definitely elements that are sort of built up. There is definitely a sort of structure that they do follow that has kind of carried on into the MCU. I don't know how intentional it was, but it is told well. There is definitely a bit of a MacGuffin kind of story going through this, and the hero versus villain being mirrored in some way. It does sort of borrow a lot of elements of like horror movies. It does have horror sequences which are handled very well. It balances that with action. There's a lot of action in this film. It is a movie you do need to sort of pay attention to, because there is a lot of information that is thrown at you. There's a lot of in-depth knowledge that you kind of need to understand about the world the vampires inhabit, especially when it comes to like Blaze and his backstory, which they do sort of show, but it's more of an exposition dump. Part of me does kind of question how it is that everyone sort of knows how Blade sort of came to be, but you just sort of go with it. And as I said, because I'm somebody who is aware of who the character was, and because I'd seen the 90s series, I sort of knew Blade's origins, I sort of knew all the connection with like his mother and all that. I wasn't really too surprised going into this movie because I was thinking, oh, I know the story, it should be absolutely fine. But there are surprises in store. It does take a few twists and a few turns that you might not be expecting if you aren't as familiar with the character, or if your experience is just with the 90s series. There are definitely surprises there. There is quite a bit of familiarity as well. I think it is handled very well, it's paced very well. I just think that there are definitely elements that I think they could have built up a little bit more. And when I say there's a lot of information that you need to get across in this movie, it's mostly like the vampire lore and mythology that they are introducing in this film, because these aren't necessarily like the classic vampires that you'd normally see from like the older Dracula films. This movie kind of introduces like a bit more of a modern take on vampires, and not in like a Twilight way. Less said on that the better. It takes the things that you are aware of. It has a lot of familiar elements that you will sort of know about, whether like you're a fan of the vampire mythology or not, especially when it comes to like the sunlight and the steaks and garlic and things like that. But it takes it and it basically says like, look, this is the stuff that logically works, this is the stuff that doesn't. So you have like UV lighting definitely affects vampires very severely, and there's some pretty nasty reactions to it, which does make sense. And I think like the makeup sort of helps with that, because like the vampires are a lot paler than you'd normally see them. I think like even like the lips look a little bit blue because they're a little bit drained of blood, which is quite a clever thing to include, and it's very subtle. They're allergic to garlic as well, so injecting them with either garlic or spraying them with it definitely has a very nasty reaction to them. There's some pretty grisly moments in this movie. It's one of those movies that when I was sort of watching it, I was thinking like, this could get away with being a 15. I mean, the third one is, why shouldn't this one be? And then there's just a few moments where it just goes just a tiny bit further than you're expecting it to, and it's like, that's why it's an 18. But the lore is handled very well, it is introduced very naturally, there is a lot of talk, but you do get to see the inner workings of this world, especially with the way that Deacon Frost is introduced, and you see like all this panel of vampires all sort of discussing their future. And there is an element in this movie that they barely address, that they do sort of show a little flicker of. There is a deleted scene that goes a bit more in depth in it. It isn't until Blade Trinity that you really see this, and it's like a human farm where it's like one of the characters very early on in the movie is going to a nightclub, and it's basically in like this big slaughterhouse in the back of it. So you see like these cows and all sorts of strung up from the ceiling, and then as he sort of goes through the building, there's somebody who like brushes past him, and you see like these big white plastic things with like the outline of a human in them. It'll take you a couple of views to really sort of notice that, but it is there, and I am glad that they do sort of acknowledge it in the future. The mythology is brought up to the modern day in a very believable way, and I do like how the vampires are handled in this. But with the way that the mythology is sort of handled in this movie, it does make me question a lot of the influence that this movie did have on not only vampire movies and superheroes, but a lot of other films that were kind of coming out around the time as well, because there are sequences that I would say do kind of echo things from The Matrix, which came out a year later. Like there's a sequence which is basically bullet time before The Matrix did it. Plus when it comes to the costumes that they're using as well, like this to me might be the movie that really sort of kick-started the whole black shades and leather coats and like black clothes and all sorts. There are definitely echoes of that in things like Underworld, and even the X-Men as well, with the way that they've got like leather clothes in their films. There might have been other movies before this that might have had an effect and might have influenced this in some way, but I do think that this is the movie that really sort of big kickstart it. This is an action movie at the end of the day, and there are definitely a lot of action sequences throughout, and I think that they are handled very well. They're very hard hitting. There is definitely like a bit of the sound design definitely sort of amplifies this, because it definitely makes like the punches and kicks all sort of sound 10 times more powerful than you really would expect. The choreography is great. There is definitely a very brutal streak that goes throughout this movie. I believe Wesley Snipes was actually involved in the choreography for this movie, which does make sense because he does do a lot of the fight sequences himself. They are shot well. I do think that they are paced out nicely. I do think you can get to see everything that's going on. Most of the sequences that are in this movie are quite short. There are like a few little bursts of action here and there, like where he's in like the vampire museum, and a few other moments with like the police officer and things like that. There's two really big sequences that open and close this movie, and they're the best sequences hands down. The opening club sequence is like a music video, and it's a brilliant opening sequence. I love the way that the tension sort of built up and there's a little bit of mystery. You're not quite sure what's going on. You're following this character who's basically being dragged along by this woman who turns out to be a vampire, and you're not quite sure what's going on. You're sort of aware that there's all this weird stuff going on around him. I like that he's slowly starting to sort of piece it together, and he's a bit confused with what's going on, and the way that like the tension just builds up, the way that like there's a bloodbath quite literally. It's a really iconic opening sequence. It's a great way to open not only the series but for like the good Marvel movies that came. And then they introduced Blade, where it's just like him just standing there, the music all just completely goes silent, and then there's that shot where all the vampires are like sort of like pulling away, and you can see him in the centre and they're all like posing towards him. It's just, that to me is an iconic Blade shot, and I think that it is absolutely fantastic. Plus the final battle with Blade kind of taking on all these vampires, plus the final battle with Deacon Frost, which is a very different finale than what they originally planned on doing, because apparently what they wanted originally was, the thing that Frost is after is something called La Magra, which is basically like this blood god, and in the original version apparently it was going to be like this big huge blood tornado, and apparently it is available online if you do want to see it. It is a deleted scene that they did film, and there are hints to that happening throughout the movie, but test audiences said they'd rather see an ending with Frost going up against Blade, and I completely agree with that, because it definitely provides the climax that we need for this movie and the closure that the characters need. But the fights are really good for that sequence, because it goes in from like the big group section into the Frost fight, and like I love seeing Blade taking on a whole army of people because they are just so satisfying to watch. Choreography, everything, brilliant. I love what they're able to do. It really amps up just how brutal this film is as well, because it really does earn the 18 certificate. There's even a sequence where like he's tearing through everyone, and then there's like one of the vampires runs up towards him, and then like Blade grabs hold and rips out his throat and then throws it at someone else. Like, okay, but there is something that I don't like about these action sequences, and it's not necessarily just relegated to the action sequences. It is something that happens throughout the movie, and that's the editing style. I've always been under the impression that Stephen Norrington, the director, was a director of music videos. I've tried looking this up, I can't seem to find anything for it, so I don't know how true it is or not, but that's the impression that I kind of get throughout this movie. It definitely makes sense. It works very well for the opening sequence because it kind of plays out like that, but it happens a lot throughout the movie. And it's kind of hard to see a lot of everything that's going on because some of the edits are just so fast and quick and hectic that you can't always make out everything that's happening. It's nowhere near as bad as something like Bourne Identity, which is like ridiculously fast. But it does help add towards the speed of these characters in a similar way. But one thing that they do is they add a lot of like little flashes and all sorts, whereas like a sequence where Blade spots his sword when it's being embedded into a wall, and then there's like it's sort of like a flash towards it, and then it like zooms out, and then also some really weird sort of camera tricks and techniques that they use in this one. Some of the flashes do admittedly work, I think, like when it comes to like some of the flashbacks when Blade sees Karen on the floor and then he kind of has like a flashback to his mother, and that works very well. I do think that that does actually land, but a lot of the time it is a little bit hard to see everything that's going on because there's just so much and it's just a little bit too hectic. The biggest sequence that I really don't like is actually the car chase when Blade is in his car and he's pursuing the police officer who's going to this club, and for some reason it is weirdly sped up to be faster, and the sound design's all over the place. It sounds like generic things that you'd find on YouTube, and it just doesn't work. It's just such a strange sequence because you can tell it's sped up from the way that everything around the cars is all sort of moving quite fast, and the way that the cars like really like turning all sorts. And there's like even like the cop when he's like talking on the radio, you can see that it's dubbed over and it looks really weird. The only time that the speed up effect actually does work is when you see the changing of the day, when you have like a nice sunny day and then next thing all the shadows like coming up over the buildings and the clouds are coming over and the moon comes. Those sequences work very well, and I think that's the only time that those sped up effects really do work. But as I said, this does have a very cheesy kind of side to it, and you know, it is dark, it is serious, but there is elements of those cheesiness kind of elements coming through in this, and the car chase definitely does add to that. But it is balanced very well. I do think that the cheesiness is handled well, and then we do get some like really serious stuff, like there's a sequence of the zombie and all sorts in it. It's handled very well. I do like that it never feels out of place. It does feel like this is a very consistent film. Like the biggest forms of tension in this movie come from the characters in the conflict, because you have Blade, who is half vampire, half human, and his biggest conflict is that he can turn, he potentially could become a full vampire, but he needs this serum to kind of stop himself from becoming bloodthirsty. That's handled very well, and especially the sequences where he's away from his serum, he's starting to get a bit hungry, and I like how those sequences are handled. Even Karen, the way that she gets involved with Blade, she's bitten, and again, she could turn into a vampire, and there is a lot of tension around whether or not she will. It's built up very well. And there is a sequence in which Whistler could quite easily have blown himself up when he's trying to fill his car up with petrol, and then he pulls out a lighter from his pocket, lights it up and lights a cigarette. Don't do that. I know you can get away with that because it's an 18, but it's not advisable. When it comes to the effects that are used throughout this film, it's very mixed for me, because this is a movie that did come out in the 90s, and I do think that a lot of the effects do look a little bit dated. The makeup definitely helps. I think that there are moments where it does look very good. There is a lot of practical stuff that is utilised throughout this film. It does make it believable, it does sell the realism of this, but there are sequences that just don't look great. There's a lot of green screen projections that happen like when they're in the car, or during the hospital sequence where Blade jumps across rooftops. It doesn't look right. It's just odd how it's handled. It might be the lighting that they've used. I like how it's kind of blurred together. There is actually quite a nice little shot where like Karen gets thrown across, and yeah, that looks really dodgy, but then she actually lands on the other side and you see her actually moving around, and you're like, oh, so it kind of works, but at the same time it kind of doesn't. This is also just before they really started using CG models of characters, so there are moments where they do sort of do it and they're not great. You can definitely tell they are very cartoony. Appreciate that most of it is very practical. I do think that the practical stuff does hold up very well, but the CG effects and a few of the green screen moments, they're just not as good as they really could have been. I do think that it was wise of them to sort of stay away from it. Blade 2 and Blade 3, they definitely did start kind of doubling down on it, especially the ones in the early 2000s, even things like The Matrix and all sorts. The CG doubles don't look good in those early 2000s movies. This one can just about get away with it. It doesn't really take you out of the movie, but it doesn't look great. The music that's used by Mark Isham is not my favourite. It's a very drum and bass kind of soundtrack and kind of electronic, and it does suit the movie. It does show the tone and the aesthetic that they go for, especially because a lot of this movie does take place in like clubs. It's not really my kind of music. I think that some of the song choices that they use as well, some of them I don't mind, but they're not really my favourite. I don't think the soundtrack's great in this movie. It does suit this movie, it does add to the tension, it does build up a few of those sequences, but it's very one note. There's not really very memorable themes. You can't really remember a lot of the music that's throughout this movie outside of the club sequence at the beginning and the big fight at the end. That's really the only sequences that I can really remember. Maybe the theme that's in the credits, that's okay. But yeah, the music overall, I think it's fine. It does work for this movie, but personally it's not really my thing. When it comes to this movie overall, this is a very good film. This is a really good start to the franchise. I think it does provide a bit of a blueprint for what Marvel ultimately did become, plus the inspiration and influence I think it did have on a lot of movies that did come out around the late 90s and the early 2000s. It's a very good action movie. There's a really nice story to it. It is very well handled and paced. There are definitely a few elements of horror that are handled very well, and they are integrated very well into this movie. It never feels like there's ever a competition of what sort of tonal style they really want to go for, but it is very grown up. This is definitely not a movie for kids, and it really kind of earns that. Casting's good, the music's fine. I don't like it, as I've said, but it does work. When it comes to the editing and some of the camera operation, it's a bit mixed for me. Some of the editing's a little bit too hectic and I think that it could have been toned down a little bit. Camera wise, I think that it is shot very nicely, but there are sequences that were a bit hard to watch. Like there's a sequence during the hospital scene quite early on and the camera's just shaking all the time. It's really hard to see what's going on. I just think, just use a steady cam or something. It would have just solved that easily. God, that's nitpicky. But yeah, overall, it is a very good movie. I think if you are a big Marvel fan, this is something that you do need to see. This is like the first good Marvel movie that was ever released, so it is definitely worth checking out. If you're into your action movies, definitely have a look at this. If you're looking for something a bit more horrifying, have a look. If you're looking for something for Halloween, I think this movie is definitely a good one to start with. Yes, it is a little bit dated, but personally I can put that aside. There are definitely some effects that don't quite look as good, but it does add to the overall sort of tone and sort of cheesiness that this movie does have. I do enjoy it. It is a very good, very fun movie. Blade's a great character. I love Wesley Snipes as him. I think they had a very good villain in this film. The supporting cast is great, and I think that this is one of the better movies in the Blade franchise. So with all that being said, my rating for Blade is going to be an 8 out of 10. Well, that's pretty much everything I've got to say for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you've seen this movie, whether you liked it or not. Where would you rank it in the Blade trilogy? Please like and subscribe, it really does help out this channel. If you do want to keep up to date on everything that's going on here, make sure you hit the notification button so you see everything that's happening. I am available on Facebook as well, on rewindreviews.youtube, where I just post out a few little updates and even like the thumbnails for these videos. If you have any suggestions for future movies, future rewinds you want me to do, whether it's films, TV, games, let me know down in the comments and I'll try and get around to them one day. I am planning on getting around to doing reviews for Blade 2 and Blade Trinity, and they will be coming out very soon, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for subscribing as well. There's been a lot of subscribers who have been coming onto this channel, and honestly I really do appreciate all the support I've been getting, so thank you so much, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.